An elephant disappeared without a trace for 9 long years, then suddenly returned with her baby calf to find the man who once saved her life. In the heart of the African wilderness, an extraordinary reunion was about to unfold, defying everything we thought we knew about animal memory. What drives a wild elephant to remember a human face after nearly a decade? And what compelled her to trek for miles, with her vulnerable calf in tow, to introduce her baby to this man? This is the story of a bond so powerful, it transcended time, distance, and the very laws of nature itself. The year was 2006. At a wildlife sanctuary on the outskirts of Tsavo East National Park in Kenya, a call came in that would change everything. A young female elephant, barely 3 years old, had been found alone, emaciated, wounded, and terrified. Her herd was nowhere in sight. The local rangers who discovered her reported hearing distant gunshots days earlier, a grim indication that poachers had likely been in the area. The timing suggested the unthinkable. This baby elephant may have witnessed the slaughter of her family. David Sheldrick, a dedicated conservationist who had devoted his life to saving orphaned elephants, rushed to the scene. The journey took him through miles of parched savanna, where drought had already claimed many wild animals that season. What he found when he arrived broke his heart. A baby elephant with a deep gash in her leg, likely from a poacher's snare. She was delirious from infection, her eyes clouded with pain and fear. Her small body trembled with each labored breath, and she had collapsed beneath the sparse shade of an acacia tree, too weak to stand. "She won't make it through the night," whispered one of the veterinarians, looking at her festering wound. The infection had spread, her body temperature dangerously high. Most elephants in this condition simply gave up the will to live. The trauma of losing their herd, their family, often proved as fatal as any physical wound. Elephants are profoundly social creatures, and orphans frequently die from what the locals called broken heart syndrome, a deep depression that robs them of their will to survive. David knew the odds were stacked against them. He'd seen too many orphaned elephants succumb to their injuries or die from the sheer trauma of losing their families. 20 years of conservation work had taught him harsh lessons about the fragility of young elephants. But something in this elephant's eyes, a fierce determination beneath the suffering, made him refuse to accept that fate. There was a spark there, barely visible through the haze of pain, but unmistakable to someone who had worked with these magnificent creatures for decades. "We're taking her back to the sanctuary," David announced, silencing the doubtful murmurs around him. "She deserves every chance we can give her." The journey back was perilous. They fashioned a makeshift stretcher from canvas and poles, carefully lifting the young elephant's 500-pound body. Every bump in the road elicited a pained rumble from her throat, each sound piercing David's heart. Twice they had to stop to administer fluids, the elephant's life hanging by an increasingly thin thread. For 3 sleepless nights after reaching the sanctuary, David stayed by her side. He bathed her wound, administered antibiotics, and spoke to her in soft, reassuring tones. When she refused to eat, he mixed special formulas of milk enriched with coconut oil and vitamins, feeding her by hand, sometimes just a few spoonfuls at a time. When she trembled with fever, he stayed beside her, cooling her with water through the darkest hours. Other staff members urged him to rest, but David refused to leave. Something told him that his presence was as crucial to her recovery as any medicine. "Elephants never forget," he explained to a new volunteer who questioned his round-the-clock vigilance. "Right now, she's learning whether humans can be trusted. Everything, her willingness to eat, to heal, to live, depends on that trust." the sanctuary's more experienced staff understood. They had seen it before, the invisible but powerful bond that sometimes formed between rescuer and rescued. It wasn't just sentimentality. It was often the difference between life and death for these traumatized orphans. But what David didn't know was that every gentle touch, every soothing word, was creating something far more powerful than medicine could ever achieve. In those critical hours, as he wiped her fevered brow and whispered encouragements, neural pathways were forming in the young elephant's brain. Pathways that would encode his scent, his voice, his very essence into her memory with extraordinary precision. On the fourth morning, something miraculous happened. The little elephant, whom David had named Kina, after the Swahili word for firm and resolute, reached out her trunk and touched his face. It was the first voluntary contact she had initiated, a tiny gesture that signaled an enormous breakthrough. The staff who witnessed it stood in stunned silence. In that moment, something shifted in the atmosphere of the medical enclosure. Hope replaced despair. Her fever broke later that day. The infection began to recede, and when David approached with food, she no longer turned away, but accepted it with a newfound trust that brought tears to his eyes. By the week's end, she was standing on her own, her wound still severe but no longer life-threatening. The sanctuary's head veterinarian, who had initially given Kina less than a 5% chance of survival, could only shake his head in amazement. "I've been treating wildlife for 20 years, he confessed to David. "But sometimes these elephants still manage to surprise me. She's fighting with everything she has." Against all odds, Kina was fighting to live, and day by day, her body healed while something profound blossomed between them. A connection that transcended the natural boundaries between man and wild animal. David found himself spending every free moment with her, and Kina would become visibly distressed when he left, calming only when he returned. The sanctuary staff began to joke that she had adopted him as her new family. As weeks turned into months, Kina's physical wounds healed completely, leaving only a jagged scar on her hind leg as a reminder of her ordeal. She began to interact with other orphaned elephants at the sanctuary, learning the social behavior she would need to eventually return to the wild. But through it all, her special bond with David remained unbreakable. When he called her name across the compound, she would come running, her ears flapping with excitement, her trunk raised to catch his scent. David knew that this bond, as precious as it was, represented both triumph and challenge. For Kina to truly heal, to become the wild elephant she was meant to be, she would eventually need to transfer her trust from him to her own kind. It was the bittersweet reality of successful rehabilitation. The stronger their connection grew, the harder their inevitable separation would be. But their journey together was only beginning. And what waited ahead would test the limits of this fragile trust in ways neither could possibly imagine. The true measure of their bond would not be found in these early days of rescue and recovery, but in the years to come, and in a reunion that defied all expectations. The sanctuary's medical enclosure became Kina's world for the weeks following her rescue. A simple structure of wooden posts and corrugated metal roofing, it offered protection from the elements while allowing for constant monitoring. The dirt floor was covered with fresh straw daily, and a small water trough sat in one corner. Modest accommodations, but a far cry from the harsh wilderness where she had nearly perished. David transformed a small storage room adjacent to the enclosure into temporary living quarters, determined to remain close through these critical early days. He furnished it with nothing more than a cot, a camping lantern, and a footlocker containing changes of clothes. Comfort wasn't the priority. Proximity was. The physical wounds were straightforward enough to treat. Antibiotics for the infection, regular cleaning and dressing of the leg wound, a carefully formulated diet to address her severe malnutrition. The veterinary team established a rigorous protocol. Medication twice daily, wound cleaning every 4 hours, nutritional supplements mixed into a special formula that mimicked elephant mother's milk. But the emotional trauma proved far more challenging to heal. Nightmares plagued Kinna's sleep, causing her to wake trembling and disoriented, often emitting distress calls that tore at David's heart. These vocalizations, high-pitched, keening sounds, unlike anything he had heard from a healthy elephant, would echo through the sanctuary in the darkest hours of night, causing the other rescued elephants to grow restless in response. "She's calling for her mother," explained Fatima, the sanctuary's headkeeper, after one particularly difficult night when Kinna's cries had continued for nearly 2 hours without cessation. They never stopped looking for their families, not really, especially the young ones. Fatima had been working with orphaned elephants for over 20 years, her weathered face and calloused hands testament to decades of dedication. Her eyes held the wisdom of countless rescues, both successful and heartbreaking. Elephants form bonds as deep and complex as human relationships, with grief responses that mirror our own. Scientific studies had documented elephants returning to the remains of family members years after their deaths, gently touching the bones with their trunks in what researchers could only interpret as mourning rituals. Fatima had seen orphaned elephants waste away despite receiving perfect physical care, their spirits broken by the loss of their herd. The younger the elephant, the more vulnerable they were to this devastating emotional collapse. At 3 years old, Kina was at a critical age, old enough to remember her family vividly, yet young enough to still be dependent on maternal care in the wild. "The first month is decisive," Fatima told David as they observed Kina from outside the enclosure. "If they haven't found a reason to live by then, they usually don't make it, no matter how well their bodies might be healing." At first, Kina accepted David's presence with resignation, rather than trust. She allowed him to treat her wounds and would take food from his hand. But her eyes remained distant, guarded, the dull gaze of an animal who had surrendered to circumstances rather than engaged with them. When he approached, she neither welcomed nor rejected him, a passive acceptance that worried him more than outright fear would have. She would stand for hours in the same position, barely shifting her weight, her trunk hanging limply, her usual elephant behavior suspended in a kind of emotional stasis. "She's shut down," he confided to Fatima one evening, as they observed Kina standing motionless in her enclosure, her trunk hanging limply, eyes fixed on nothing. The setting sun cast long shadows across the dirt floor, but Kina seemed unaware of the changing light, unresponsive to the evening feeding routines that caused other elephants in the sanctuary to rumble with anticipation. "It's like she's not really here anymore. Her body's healing, but I'm afraid we're losing her mind." Fatima considered this with the gravity it deserved. She had seen this before, the physical form surviving while the essential spirit of the elephant faded away. "Give her time," Fatima advised, placing a reassuring hand on David's shoulder. "And give her something to live for beyond just surviving." Elephants are profoundly social creatures. They need connection even more than they need medicine. Taking this counsel to heart, David began spending every moment he could with Kina, not just attending to her physical needs, but simply being present. He brought a folding chair into her enclosure and sat reading aloud while she stood or lay nearby, his voice providing a constant, soothing backdrop to her days. He read everything from scientific journals to adventure novels. The content less important than the consistent human connection it represented. He played recordings of elephant calls collected from healthy herds, hoping to remind her of the social bonds that defined elephant existence. The sounds, rumbles so deep they were felt more than heard, trumpets of greeting, the gentle chirps mothers used to reassure calves, sometimes caused Kinna's ears to flick forward in momentary attention before she retreated back into her emotional withdrawal. Most importantly, he established unwavering routines, feeding times, bathing rituals, gentle physiotherapy for her injured leg, creating a predictable world in which she might gradually feel secure again. In the wild, elephant herds operate on remarkably consistent daily patterns, their movements between water sources and feeding grounds following ancient rhythms passed down through generations. David hoped to recreate some semblance of that predictability, believing it might help anchor Kinna's dislocated sense of self. Consistency builds trust, Fatima had told him, and trust is the foundation of healing. 2 weeks into this regimen, the first breakthrough came in an unexpected form. During her morning bath, as David gently sponged water over her back, speaking softly about the day ahead, Kinna suddenly reached out with her trunk and took the sponge from his hand. The movement was so unexpected that David froze, uncertain whether this was aggression or curiosity. Rather than dropping it or tossing it aside as he expected, she dipped it in the water bucket and with surprising dexterity squeezed water over her own shoulder, mimicking exactly the motion she had seen him perform dozens of times before. David stood frozen, afraid to break the spell of this first autonomous action. It wasn't just that she had taken the sponge, it was that she had used it purposefully, demonstrating not only physical coordination, but intentionality. The first clear sign that some essential spark still lived within her. When she finished and dropped the sponge back in the bucket, he whispered, "Well done, Kinna. That's exactly right." Her eyes met his then, truly met his, perhaps for the first time. And something flickered in their depths. Not trust yet, but awareness, recognition, the beginning of connection. For a brief moment, the vacant look was replaced by something more present, more engaged. Then it faded, but not completely. Some small light remained where before there had been only emptiness. David reported this moment to the sanctuary team with barely contained excitement. "It's a start," the head veterinarian cautioned, tempering expectations. "But it's significant. Keep doing whatever you're doing." Progress from that point came in small, precious increments. A week later, she began rumbling softly when she heard his footsteps approaching each morning. A sound distinctly different from the distress calls that had characterized her nights. It was a greeting, an acknowledgement, perhaps even an expression of anticipation. The week after that, she initiated physical contact, her trunk gently exploring his arm while he sat reading, the sensitive tip investigating the texture of his skin, his watch, the book in his hands. By the end of the first month, she would wait by the enclosure gate when she knew it was time for his arrival. Her ears spread wide in anticipation, her body oriented toward the path he always took from the main compound. Small behavioral changes accumulated into larger transformations. She began to explore her enclosure more actively, showing interest in fresh branches brought in for her to browse upon. She started dust bathing, a natural elephant behavior where they toss dirt over their backs for sun protection and parasite control. Most encouragingly, she began to vocalize in ways that weren't expressions of distress, but rather seemed communicative, directed specifically at David when he entered or prepared to leave. "She's talking to you." Fatima observed with quiet satisfaction after witnessing one such exchange. Not just making sounds, but trying to communicate. The sanctuary staff watched this developing bond with a mixture of professional approval and personal wonder. They had seen rescued elephants form attachments to their keepers before. But there was something different about Kinna's relationship with David. A depth of mutual recognition that transcended the usual dynamics. It wasn't just dependence or habituation. There seemed to be genuine affinity between them, as if some invisible thread connected man and elephant in a way that defied simple explanation. "It's as if she's chosen him," remarked one of the veterinarians after observing them together during a routine health check. Not just accepted him, but actively chosen him as her person. "I've never seen an elephant look at a human quite that way before." David was careful not to anthropomorphize these developments, reminding himself that Kinna was a wild animal with her own evolutionary psychology, not a character in a children's story. Yet he couldn't deny the growing sense that they were forming a relationship that went beyond caretaker and patient. Something that approached companionship, despite the vast differences in their species. The most dramatic evidence of this bond emerged during a violent thunderstorm that struck the sanctuary without warning one night in the 6th week after Kinna's arrival. The dry season had been interrupted by an unseasonable weather system that brought cracking lightning and deafening thunder, rolling across the savanna. Lightning crashed overhead, and torrential rain hammered against the metal roof of the enclosure with a roar that made human conversation impossible. Kinna, like many elephants, showed intense fear of electrical storms, a natural response for animals whose size made them vulnerable to lightning strikes in the wild. As the tempest reached its peak, she began to panic, her eyes wide with terror, her massive body pacing increasingly frantic circles in the confined space. Then, as a particularly violent thunderclap shook the ground, she began charging the walls of her enclosure with enough force to make the wooden posts creak alarmingly. The night watchman raised the alarm, and staff came running through the downpour, fearing that Kinna might injure herself or break through the enclosure entirely. David rushed from his quarters, soaked to the skin within seconds. Fatima intercepted him at the enclosure gate, her face grave in the beam of emergency flashlights. "She's in full panic," she shouted over the storm. "Too dangerous to go in there now." But David could see that Kinna was beyond rational fear, driven by instincts that told her to flee the threatening sounds. Each impact against the enclosure walls risked serious injury. A broken tusk, a fractured leg, wounds that could set her recovery back by months or worse. Making a split-second decision that his more rational mind might have questioned, he pushed past Fatima and unlatched the gate, stepping into the enclosure despite the staff's shouted warnings. Kinna was at the far end, preparing for another charge. For one heart-stopping moment, it seemed she might not recognize him in her terror. The 3 tons of panicked elephant might simply run him down in her desperate attempt to escape the storm. David stood his ground, calling her name, his voice nearly lost in the cacophony of rain and thunder. She began her charge, gathering momentum across the enclosure. The staff members watching held their breath collectively, some turning away, unable to watch what seemed inevitable. Instead, she stopped abruptly, her massive form trembling just inches from where he stood, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her body, smell the distinctive musty scent of her breath. Recognition dawned in her eyes. Recognition and something more profound. Then, in a gesture that left onlookers breathless, she curled her trunk around his waist and pulled him gently against her chest, as if seeking comfort from his presence rather than offering it. It was a gesture of vulnerability and trust so unexpected that even Fatima, with all her decades of experience, later admitted she had never witnessed anything quite like it. They remained that way throughout the storm, the man leaning against the elephant, speaking softly as thunder rolled overhead. David kept up a constant stream of reassurances, his hands stroking her trunk, her ears, the rough skin of her shoulder. Gradually, her trembling subsided. Her breathing slowed from panicked gasps to something approaching normal. By morning, when the skies finally cleared, something fundamental had shifted between them. The tentative connection had crystallized into something unbreakable. "What happened last night?" Fatima told him as they watched the sunrise together, Kinna now sleeping peacefully in her enclosure. "That doesn't happen. Not with an elephant who's only known you for 6 weeks. Not with an elephant who's been through what she has." "Then what does it mean?" David asked, exhausted but exhilarated by the night's events. Fatima considered this, her eyes on the sleeping elephant. "It means she trusts you more than she fears death," she said finally. "And for an animal, there is no greater gift of trust than that." Physical recovery accelerated alongside this emotional healing. Kinna's wound closed cleanly, leaving a jagged scar but no permanent lameness. Her emaciated frame filled out as her appetite returned in full force, her ribs gradually disappearing beneath healthy layers of muscle and fat. Her coat, once dull and hanging in folds, began to take on the healthy sheen of a thriving juvenile elephant. Her eyes, perhaps the most telling indicator of all, grew bright and alert, tracking movements with intelligence and curiosity rather than dull resignation. The medical team gradually reduced her treatments, transitioning from intensive care to maintenance monitoring. Blood tests confirmed what visual assessment suggested. Kinna was physically recovering at a remarkable rate. Her strength returned, allowing for longer periods of activity. Her dexterity improved, her trunk regaining the extraordinary precision that made elephants such adaptable feeders in the wild. "She's ready for the next step," Fatima announced, after conducting a thorough assessment 6 weeks after Kinna's arrival. She presented her findings at the weekly staff meeting, where each elephant's progress was discussed and treatment plans adjusted. "Physically, she's stabilized beyond our most optimistic projections. Emotionally, she's formed a secure attachment. She needs to start remembering how to be an elephant, not just a patient." This meant introducing her to the sanctuary's kindergarten herd, other orphaned elephants of similar age who were further along in their rehabilitation. These elephants spent their days in a more naturalistic environment, learning to forage, dust bathe, and socialize under the watchful eyes of their keepers. The initial introduction would be delicate. Elephants form complex social hierarchies, and newcomers could face rejection if the integration wasn't handled carefully. "We'll introduce her to Malaika first," Fatima proposed, referring to a gentle female elephant who had shown particular aptitude for welcoming newcomers in the past. "If that goes well, we'll gradually integrate her with the others over the course of a week." On the morning of this crucial meeting, David found himself unexpectedly anxious. He had prepared Kinna as best he could, spending extra time grooming her, speaking soothingly about the new friends she would meet. But as the appointed hour approached, he realized his anxiety stemmed not from concern for the introduction itself, but from something more personal. Kinna's bond with him had become a cornerstone of her recovery, but it was also, in some ways, an obstacle to her ultimate rehabilitation. For her to truly heal, she would need to form connections with her own kind, connections that might eventually diminish her reliance on him. "It's always this way," Fatima told him, recognizing the conflict in his expression as they walked together toward the larger enclosure where the meeting would take place. The morning sun cast long shadows across the compound, and the air was filled with the sounds of elephants trumpeting greetings to one another. Sounds that Kinna had heard, but not participated in during her isolation. The better you've done your job, the harder this part becomes. Success means letting go, at least a little. The introduction took place in the sanctuary's largest enclosure, a spacious area with shade trees and a small mud wallow that the elephants had expanded through enthusiastic use. The kindergarten herd, 5 elephants between 2 and 4 years old, was allowed in first, giving them the psychological advantage of established territory. They moved about the space with the comfortable familiarity of regular inhabitants, some browsing on acacia branches, others wallowing in the mud. Then, with David walking beside her, Kinna entered. The keepers had removed her medical harness for the occasion, wanting her to appear as natural as possible to her potential new companions. She walked with increasing confidence, her gait almost normal now, despite the scarring on her leg. But as they passed through the gate, she pressed closer to David's side, her trunk occasionally touching his arm as if seeking reassurance. The tension was immediate and palpable. The other elephants froze, trunks raised to catch her scent. Their ears spread wide, not in aggression, but in acute attention. Kinna pressed against David's side, her body rigid with apprehension. For several minutes, no one moved. The keepers maintained a respectful silence, understanding that this delicate social negotiation needed to proceed at the elephant's own pace. Then Malaika, a gentle 3-year-old female who had been at the sanctuary longest, took a tentative step forward. She was smaller than Kinna despite being of similar age, a testament to the better nutrition Kinna had received in her early years before the trauma of separation from her herd. Malaika extended her trunk toward Kinna, who flinched away initially, pressing even closer to David. He held his breath. Everything depended on this moment. "Stay still," Fatima whispered from where she stood at the enclosure's edge. "Let them work it out." Slowly, hesitantly, Kinna extended her own trunk in response. The 2 appendages touched, twined briefly, and then separated. It wasn't immediate acceptance, but it was acknowledgement, the beginning of something that could grow into companionship. Malaika took another step forward, then another, until she stood directly before Kinna. Then, in a gesture that caused the watching keepers to exchange meaningful glances, she turned and presented her side, an invitation to touch, to establish physical connection beyond the initial trunk greeting. After a moment's hesitation, Kinna reached out and placed her trunk lightly on Malaika's back. The smaller elephant rumbled softly, a sound of acceptance. The tension in the enclosure dissipated perceptibly. "That's it," Fatima breathed. "First contact established. We're on our way." Over the following days, Kinna gradually integrated into the kindergarten herd. She remained somewhat aloof, preferring to follow rather than lead. But she no longer showed fear of the other elephants. She learned to participate in group activities, synchronized drinking at the water trough, dust baths in the midday heat, evening gatherings under the largest shade tree. Most importantly, she began to engage in the social behaviors essential to elephant development. Mud bathing together, synchronized feeding, and the constant tactile reassurance that elephants provide one another through trunk touches and body contact. The keepers observed and documented every interaction, building a detailed picture of Kinna's social development. They noted which elephants she gravitated toward, which behaviors she adopted most readily, which aspects of elephant society seemed to come naturally to her despite her time in isolation. These observations would inform her ongoing rehabilitation plan, helping the team identify areas where she might need additional support. "She's particularly drawn to Malaika," David noted in his weekly report, "but shows interesting protective behaviors toward Tumbili, the youngest member of the kindergarten herd. This tendency to look after smaller, more vulnerable elephants suggested that Kinna's natural empathy remained intact despite her trauma, an encouraging sign for her eventual reintegration into wild elephant society, where such pro-social behaviors were essential to herd cohesion. Through it all, her bond with David remained. Each morning, she would greet him with unmistakable joy, sometimes breaking away from the herd to rush to the fence when she spotted him arriving for his shift. Her trunk would reach for him, touching his face or hands in what could only be described as affectionate recognition. Each evening, she would linger as he prepared to leave, as if reluctant to see the day end. Sometimes she would follow his departing figure with her gaze until he disappeared from view, only then returning to the company of the other elephants. "It's extraordinary," commented Dr. Eleanor Sanderson, a visiting researcher who specialized in elephant cognition. After observing this dynamic for several days, she had traveled from Cambridge University specifically to document Kinna's case, intrigued by reports of her unusual rehabilitation. "She's maintaining dual social connections, one with the herd and one with you. That's sophisticated emotional processing we rarely see in rehabilitation cases. Most orphans either transfer their attachment completely to other elephants once introduced, or they resist integration because they've imprinted too strongly on their human caregivers. She's doing neither. She's expanding her social world rather than merely shifting attachments." "Is that good?" David asked, watching as Kenya engaged in a playful pushing match with another young female, their trunks entwined, their movements showing the careful restraint that indicated play rather than genuine conflict. "It's remarkable," Dr. Sanderson replied. "And yes, I think it bodes extremely well for her long-term prospects. She's demonstrating exceptional emotional intelligence and adaptability. Those qualities will serve her well if she eventually returns to the wild." As weeks turned to months, Kinna blossomed. Her confidence grew, her health stabilized completely, and she began to display the natural curiosity that characterized healthy juvenile elephants. She learned to forage effectively, discriminating between plant species with increasing sophistication, using her trunk to strip bark from branches and pluck tender shoots with delicate precision. She mastered the use of her trunk as both tool and sensory organ, able to detect scents from remarkable distances and manipulate objects with dexterity that approached that of a human hand. She developed a rich vocabulary of vocalizations, from the subsonic rumbles used for long-distance communication to the higher-pitched chirps and trumpets that expressed immediate emotions. The sanctuary expanded her world gradually but steadily. From the kindergarten enclosure, she progressed to supervised walks in the larger sanctuary grounds, accompanied by both her elephant companions and human keepers. These excursions grew longer and ventured farther as her stamina increased and her natural behaviors strengthened. She learned to identify water sources by smell, to test ground stability before crossing uncertain terrain, to remain alert for potential threats, all skills she would need if she were to eventually return to the wild. Yet through all these changes, through every milestone of her recovery, the thread connecting her to David only strengthened. It was as if her growing security allowed her to invest more deeply in this unusual cross-species bond, rather than less. She would seek him out specifically among the keepers, recognizing his vehicle when it approached, his footsteps when he walked behind her, his voice even when he spoke from a distance. And he found himself equally attuned to her, able to interpret subtle shifts in her body language that others missed, to anticipate her needs before she expressed them, to sense her moods with uncanny accuracy. "You've become fluent in elephant," Fatima observed one evening, watching as David adjusted his position in response to an almost imperceptible flick of Kinna's ear. a movement so subtle that Fatima herself, with all her experience, had nearly missed it. Not just Kinna speak, but the whole language. That's rare, even among those of us who've spent our lives with them. The sanctuary director, a pragmatic man not given to sentimentality, took David aside after observing one of Kinna's checkups. "What you've accomplished with her exceeds our most optimistic projections," he said, reviewing her medical charts. "When she came in, I gave her a 20% chance of physical recovery and less than 10% chance of psychological rehabilitation sufficient for eventual release. Now," he gestured toward where Kinna stood with the kindergarten herd, her posture relaxed, her interactions appropriate, her physical condition excellent. "Now, I'd place both probabilities above 90%. Whatever you're doing, it's working." On the 1-year anniversary of her rescue, the sanctuary held a small celebration. The staff gathered for a special meal, sharing stories of Kinna's progress and other rehabilitation successes. They had decorated a large acacia branch with Kinna's favorite treats: mangoes, bananas, and specially made elephant biscuits fortified with vitamins. When she discovered this edible arrangement, her delighted trumpeting brought smiles to everyone present. Later that evening, after the festivities concluded and the compound grew quiet, David sat beside her under the stars, his back resting against her warm flank. The sanctuary was quiet, except for the distant calls of night birds and the soft breathing of elephants. Kinna's trunk rested lightly across his lap, a gesture of affection and trust she often showed in these quiet moments. Above them, the African sky stretched vast and brilliant with stars, the same stars that had witnessed countless generations of elephants roaming these lands long before humans appeared. "We did it, old girl," he whispered, stroking the leathery skin of her trunk. "1 whole year. You're going to be just fine now." She rumbled softly in response, a sound so low it vibrated through his body rather than reaching his ears. In that moment, the distance between their species seemed to vanish, replaced by a connection that defied easy categorization. Not quite friendship as humans understood it. Not quite the bond between elephant and elephant, but something unique and profound that belonged only to them. What he didn't know was that the most heartbreaking moment of their story was just around the corner. The transition began with a simple folder of documents. "We need to start transitioning her to the pre-release herd," Dr. Negwa explained during the morning staff meeting. "She's physically ready, and her social integration has exceeded expectations." David nodded, though a heaviness settled in his chest. The pre-release facility was 10 miles from the main sanctuary, a sprawling enclosure bordering the national park, where elephants experienced minimal human interaction before eventual release. "The transfer will happen next week," Dr. Ndegwa continued. "We'll begin reducing human contact immediately, particularly between Kinna and David." Fatima placed a weathered hand on David's arm. "It's the right time. She's strong now." He knew they were right. From the emaciated orphan they'd rescued, Kinna had grown into a healthy, socially adept young elephant. Yet despite working toward this goal, David struggled with the impending separation. Their bond had grown into something profound, a connection transcending typical human-animal interactions. The separation protocol began immediately. Where David once spent hours with Kinna, he now observed from a distance. Other keepers took over her care routines, establishing their own relationships with her. Kinna noticed immediately. She trumpeted repeatedly when David failed to appear, pacing the fence line and scanning the horizon. For 3 days, she called for him, her vocalization shifting from expectant to plaintive. Each cry pierced David like physical pain. She's grieving, Dr. Sanderson observed. It's remarkably similar to what we see when elephants lose family members in the wild. There's searching, calling, depression, and eventually acceptance. By week's end, the most obvious signs of distress began subsiding. Kina no longer called continuously. Her appetite returned, and she resumed more normal interactions with her companions. But a watchfulness remained, an alertness to any approaching human that suggested adaptation rather than forgetting. The night before transfer, David received permission for a brief farewell. He entered Kina's enclosure just after sunset. At first, she didn't register his presence, but when the wind shifted, carrying his scent, she turned with surprising speed. Recognition was immediate. She crossed the enclosure rapidly, trunk extended. When she touched his face, he closed his eyes against sudden tears. "Hello, old girl," he whispered. "I've missed you too." For their brief time together, they stood in quiet communion. David spoke softly about her future, the new places she would explore, the wild elephants she might meet. When their time ended, he pressed his forehead briefly against her trunk, a gesture borrowed from elephant interactions, then walked away without looking back, despite her confused rumble behind him. The transfer occurred at dawn. David remained in his quarters as sounds filtered through his window, the transport vehicle's engine, staff calling instructions, elephants trumpeting at the unusual activity. From his window, he glimpsed the vehicle passing through the main gate, catching a flash of gray skin through the ventilation slats before it disappeared behind acacia trees. "Goodbye, Kina," he whispered. "Be wild. Be free." 3 months later, David visited the pre-release facility to observe from a distance. Through binoculars, he watched Kina at the waterhole. She had changed, grown physically, but also gained confidence in her movements, comfort with her surroundings, ease with companions. She waded into water, splashing playfully, submerging until only her trunk remained visible, behavior he'd never witnessed at the sanctuary. "She's doing well," the facility manager commented. "One of our strongest candidates for release. Another year of preparation, and she'll likely be ready." After a year of preparation, the release day arrived. The perimeter fence was opened in a section adjacent to wild elephant territory, creating a corridor through which rehabilitated elephants could leave when ready. No humans would be present. Cameras would document their departure. "We don't push them out," Dr. Negwa had explained. "We simply open the door and let them decide when ready." 3 days passed with no movement. On the 4th morning, David woke to a message. Movement at 0430. Zuri led 3 others through corridor, Kina among them. It had happened. Kina had left human protection and stepped into the wild. David followed her journey through tracking data, watching as her group established territory overlapping with wild elephant ranges. On the 9th day, something changed. While her companions continued exploring, Kina separated, moving south with unexpected speed. By morning, she was heading directly toward the pre-release facility. "She's coming back," Fatima said, reviewing the data. "She's deliberately returning." David joined the observation team as Kina approached. Through binoculars, he watched her move deliberately toward the release corridor, passing through without hesitation. Once inside, she moved directly to the waterhole before rejoining the facility's elephants. 2 days later, they discovered why. Poachers had been spotted exactly where Kina had changed course. "She sensed them," Fatima said, "and knew where to find safety." After 2 weeks' recovery, Kina approached the corridor again. She stood sampling the air for nearly an hour before deliberately stepping through. This time, she moved west toward known stable elephant herds. Within days, aerial observation confirmed success. Kinna had made contact with a wild herd. Initial interactions were cautious, but by week's end, she was moving with them. Not fully integrated, but clearly tolerated. The first step toward acceptance. This is what success looks like, Dr. Ndegwa told the staff, displaying the latest photographs. From orphaned and injured to independent and social. For David, the images brought complex satisfaction. There was Kinna, moving among wild counterparts with growing confidence where she belonged. The tracking collar would provide data for years, documenting her integration into the wild. As she disappeared into the wilderness, he never imagined that this goodbye would mark the beginning of 9 long years of silence. Life at the sanctuary continued after Kinna's release. Each day brought new challenges: orphaned calves, injured adults, traumatized rescues. For David, work became both refuge and purpose, honoring what he'd learned through his bond with Kinna while continuing his mission. Tracking data provided regular updates on her progress. For the first year, these reports brightened David's routine. Each evening, he traced her movements across digital maps, noting her integration into the wild herd. Research flights returned with photographs showing her healthy and increasingly confident. "She's doing remarkably well," Dr. Sanderson commented during a visit. Her movement patterns match the matriarch's, suggesting full acceptance. And she's often positioned between calves and the perimeter, a protective role assigned to trusted females. In the second year, direct observations decreased as Kinna's herd ranged farther into remote areas. GPS data continued showing healthy movement patterns, but personal connection through photographs became sporadic. "This is actually positive," Dr. Ndegwa assured the team. "The further they move from human settlement, the more naturally they're behaving. They're following ancient elephant pathways their ancestors used for thousands of years." The third year brought the first significant gap in tracking data. 3 weeks of silence before the signal resumed, showing normal movements with the same herd. In the fourth year, during dry season, Kinna's herd moved into northern reaches, bordering territories known for increased poaching. For 2 tense weeks, David checked the data obsessively, relieved each morning to see her signal still moving normally. Then, without warning, it stopped completely. A tracking flight dispatched to her last location found nothing. No elephants, no evidence of poaching, nothing but empty savanna. Days of increasingly desperate searching yielded no trace of Kinna or her herd, no signal from her collar, no reports from rangers. "Could the collar have simply failed?" David asked, clinging to benign explanations. "It's possible," the equipment specialist acknowledged. "Battery failure, water damage, physical damage. Any could explain the loss of signal." But as weeks stretched into months, darker possibilities could no longer be ignored. Poaching, human conflict, natural disasters, disease outbreaks. "We have to face the possibility that we may never know what happened," Fatima said gently, finding David still poring over maps. "The wild reclaims its own, sometimes without leaving traces." For David, acceptance came slowly. He found himself scanning every distant herd during fieldwork, hoping for a glimpse of her distinctive scar. Each new rescue received his full professional attention, but none filled the space Kinna had occupied in his heart. 5 years after her disappearance, the sanctuary officially classified Kinna as status unknown, presumed integrated or deceased. Her data was archived, her story becoming one among many in the sanctuary's history. Life continued. David was promoted to head of rehabilitation, his experience making him particularly qualified for the sanctuary's most vulnerable cases. "You've become our elephant whisperer," Fatima teased with genuine respect. "They sense something in you, a particular understanding." 7 years after her disappearance, during a routine fence inspection, David spotted a small herd beyond the perimeter. He raised his binoculars automatically. As he watched, one female turned, presenting her left flank. There, just visible, was a long, pale scar on her hind leg. His heart jumped, then tempered with caution. Many elephants bore similar scars. Even if it were Kinna, approaching her would serve no purpose. She was wild, integrated into a herd, exactly as they had worked to achieve. David watched until the herd disappeared into acacia trees, taking no photographs, making no report. Some experiences, he had learned, were meant to remain personal, unverified by science. 9 years after her disappearance, security cameras captured something extraordinary. In pre-dawn hours, a small group of elephants appeared at the main gate, pausing there with trunks raised as if testing the air. After several minutes, they moved away, disappearing into darkness. "Probably just passing through," the security chief suggested. "Wild herds sometimes follow the sanctuary perimeter during migration." But while he had resigned himself to never seeing her again, deep in the wilderness, something remarkable was happening. Deep in the Amboseli Basin, where the shadow of Kilimanjaro stretched across golden grasslands, a remarkable transformation was unfolding. The elephant known to humans as Kinna, but to her herd as something communicated through low-frequency rumbles and subtle trunk gestures, had not only survived, but flourished in the wild. The tracking collar that had once transmitted her movements to anxious researchers had long since failed. Its battery depleted, its weathered casing now merely decorative around her neck. 9 years had changed her considerably. She had grown into full maturity, her body bearing the marks of wild living. A notch in one ear from a territorial dispute, calloused pads on her feet from thousands of miles walked across the varied terrain, and muscles hardened by daily foraging. The scar on her hind leg, that first connection to human care, had faded to a pale line barely visible against her gray skin. But the most significant change was not physical. Kinna had become a mother. The calf at her side was nearly 2 years old now, a playful female with bright eyes and a curious disposition. In the complex social structure of elephant society, this first offspring had elevated Kinna's status within the herd, integrating her more fully into the generational knowledge transfer that defined elephant culture. She had learned motherhood as she had learned all things in the wild, through observation, instinct, and the guidance of older females who had walked this path before her. The herd itself had changed over the years. Some members had died, the old matriarch succumbing to age, 2 others lost to poachers during a terrible season when armed gangs had penetrated even this protected area. New calves had been born, adolescents had matured, and the social dynamics had shifted accordingly. Through these changes, Kinna had remained, adapting to new leadership, contributing to collective defense and calf rearing, becoming an essential thread in the herd's social fabric. But recent months had brought new challenges. A prolonged drought had withered the grasslands and dried the seasonal waterholes. Competition for remaining resources intensified as wildlife concentrated around permanent water sources. The herd had been forced to range farther, venturing into territories less familiar and potentially more dangerous. Then came the fire. It began as a distant smudge on the horizon, a lightning strike igniting parched grass miles away. Under normal conditions, Such fires were part of the savanna's natural cycle, clearing old growth and promoting new. But after months without rain, this fire became something different. A racing wall of flame driven by seasonal winds, consuming everything in its path. The herd's matriarch, a female named Zikomo, who had assumed leadership after the old matriarch's death, sensed the danger before others. Her raised trunk tested the air, detecting smoke particles carried on the breeze. Her decision was immediate and decisive. They would move east, away from the advancing fire, toward the mountains where rocky terrain might offer natural fire breaks. For 2 days, the herd traveled without stopping to rest or forage properly, driven by the matriarch's urgent pace. Kinna kept her calf close, occasionally lifting the tired youngster with her trunk to help her over difficult terrain. The smoke grew thicker, ash falling like gray snow, the horizon behind them glowing ominous orange at night. On the 3rd day, they encountered an unexpected barrier. A new settlement had been established in what had once been open migration corridor. Fenced fields now blocked the traditional route to safety, with clusters of human dwellings and livestock pens creating an impassable obstacle. The matriarch's confusion was evident as she led the herd back and forth along the boundary, searching for a way through that no longer existed. The fire continued its advance, the wind carrying embers that started new blazes ahead of the main front. The herd's options narrowed by the hour, their exhaustion mounting, the youngest calves showing signs of respiratory distress from the thickening smoke. It was in this moment of crisis that something extraordinary happened. Kinna, typically a mid-ranking female who followed rather than led, moved to the front of the group. Her posture changed, her head raised, her entire demeanor projecting a confidence that commanded attention. She rumbled deeply, a sound felt more than heard by the others, then deliberately turned away from both fire and settlement, heading south with unwavering determination. The matriarch, perhaps recognizing something in Kinna's manner, did not challenge this unusual breach of hierarchy. After a moment's hesitation, she followed, bringing the rest of the herd with her. Kinna led them at a pace that balanced urgency with energy conservation, choosing routes accessible to the youngest members, finding patches of unburned vegetation where they could briefly forage to maintain strength. For 4 days, she maintained this course, navigating with a precision that suggested more than random flight. When they finally emerged from the smoke-filled air into clearer skies, they found themselves in a landscape that Kinna alone seemed to recognize. A region of scattered acacia trees and rolling hills that contained a spring-fed waterhole unseen by most of the herd before. What the others couldn't know was that Kinna was retracing a journey made years earlier, following a mental map preserved in her remarkable elephant memory. She was leading them to the one place her experience suggested would offer safety: the protected lands surrounding the sanctuary, where she had once been healed. The sanctuary staff had no warning of their approach. The perimeter fence, designed to keep poachers out rather than elephants in, presented no significant barrier to a determined herd. They crossed onto sanctuary land during the night, moving quietly despite their size, following Kinna's confident lead toward the water sources she remembered from her rehabilitation days. It was a junior ranger on early morning patrol who first spotted them. 17 elephants, including 3 young calves, drinking from the artificial waterhole established for resident rehabilitating elephants. The ranger radioed the main compound immediately, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "Large wild herd inside the north quadrant," he reported. "No signs of distress or aggression. They appear to be comfortable here." David was in a staff meeting when the call came through. The sanctuary's protocol for wild elephants on the property was clear. Observe from a distance, document. But do not approach or interfere unless the animals showed signs of injury or illness. Wild herds occasionally pass through sanctuary land, particularly during migration seasons or times of resource scarcity. I'll handle the observation, he volunteered, perhaps too quickly. After 9 years in elephant rehabilitation, he had developed a reputation for understanding these animals better than most. If any staff member could accurately assess whether this herd needed intervention, it was him. He took one of the sanctuary's electric vehicles, quieter than the diesel trucks, and drove slowly toward the north quadrant, stopping well back from the reported location to approach on foot. With binoculars, camera, and observation journal, he settled behind a natural blind of brush and acacia, prepared for hours of patient watching. The herd was immediately visible, still gathered around the waterhole. Even from a distance, David could see evidence of their difficult journey. Thin bodies showing the effects of drought, skin darkened by ash, a general weariness in their movements. But they were drinking and bathing, the younger ones already engaged in play, signs that their condition, while concerning, was not immediately life-threatening. He began the systematic observation that years of research had ingrained in him. Count: 17 individuals. Composition: 1 dominant matriarch, approximately 40-45 years old. 8 adult females of varying ages, 3 adolescents. 5 calves, including 1 infant probably less than a year old. Behavior: cohesive social structure, normal protective formation around youngsters, no signs of disease or severe injury visible. It was as he was noting these details that he noticed one female slightly apart from the others. She stood at the edge of the water, her calf beside her, watching the sanctuary buildings visible in the distance. Something in her posture, a stillness, an attention, caught his trained eye. He shifted position slightly for a better view through his binoculars. The female was mature but not elderly, her body condition slightly better than some others in the herd, suggesting effective foraging skills. Around her neck was what appeared to be the weathered remains of a tracking collar, long since non-functional. And on her left hind leg, just visible when she shifted position, was a long, pale scar. David lowered the binoculars, his hands suddenly unsteady. It couldn't be. After 9 years, after all the searches and speculation, after officially classifying her as status unknown, it simply couldn't be. And yet, he raised the binoculars again, focusing more carefully. The collar was consistent with the model used on Kinna and other rehabilitated elephants from that period. The scar matched the location and apparent length of her injury from the poacher's snare. Her estimated age aligned with what Kinna's would be now. But it was more than these physical markers. There was something in the way she stood, in how she positioned herself relative to her calf, in the particular angle of her head as she gazed toward the sanctuary buildings. Something that resonated with his memories of the elephant he had known so well. Protocol dictated that he should simply document this observation, return to the compound, and report it. The presence of a potentially rehabilitated elephant returning with a wild herd was scientifically significant, but didn't warrant direct intervention. The appropriate response was continued observation from a distance. David knew all this. He had helped write these protocols, had trained new staff in their implementation, had emphasized the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries with wild elephants, even if they had once been under human care. And yet, almost without conscious decision, he found himself standing, stepping out from behind the blind, walking slowly into the open where he could be seen. The reaction was immediate. Several females wheeled to face him, ears spread in warning, trunks raised to catch his scent. The matriarch moved protectively toward the youngest calves, rumbling a low alert. But the female he had been watching, the one with the collar and scar, remained still, her attention now fully fixed on his approaching figure. David stopped at a safe distance, aware that he was violating every protocol, risking not only professional consequences, but potential danger. Wild elephants, even those familiar with humans, were unpredictable, particularly when with young calves. Yet something deeper than training or caution was guiding him now. "Kinna," he said softly, the name carried away by the morning breeze. For a long moment, nothing happened. The standoff continued. Wary elephants, solitary human, the space between them charged with tension. Then the female with the collar took one step forward, then another. Her calf made to follow, but she gently blocked its path with her trunk, rumbling something that kept the youngster in place. She approached with deliberate steps, her ears neither fully spread in threat nor relaxed in comfort, but in an intermediate position, suggesting cautious assessment. The other elephants watched, alert but following their herdmate's lead in this unusual interaction. David remained motionless, his breath shallow, his heart pounding. When she was about 20 feet away, close enough for him to see the texture of her skin, the wetness around her eyes, the subtle movements of her trunk testing the air, she stopped. For what seemed an eternity, they regarded each other across a divide far greater than the physical space between them. Wild and domestic, animal and human, past and present. Then she did something that removed all doubt. She raised her trunk and touched the tip of it to her forehead, then extended it toward him. A perfect replication of the farewell gesture he had taught her 9 years earlier. The elephant-to-elephant communication he had used on their last day together. "It is you," he whispered. The moment stretched, suspended in time. A connection across years and experiences neither could communicate to the other. Then, with the same deliberateness with which she had approached, Kinna turned and walked back to her calf, rumbling softly as she reached the youngster. The tension among the herd visibly eased, the matriarch's posture relaxing, the protective circle opening slightly. David remained where he was, until they had moved away from the waterhole, heading toward a shaded area with good grazing. Only when they were settled did he finally retreat, walking backward for the first 100 yards, unwilling to fully turn away from the miracle he had witnessed. The sanctuary erupted into controlled excitement when he reported his observations. Dr. Ndegwa immediately called an emergency staff meeting. Research teams were mobilized, and verification protocols initiated. Photographs were compared, historical records consulted, experts contacted for consultation. If it is indeed Kinna, and the evidence certainly suggests it is, this would be unprecedented in our records, Dr. Ndegwa told the assembled staff. We've had rehabilitated elephants observed with wild herds before, but never one returning to the sanctuary after such complete integration, and never with a wild herd following her lead. The fire must have driven them here, suggested the head of research. Satellite imagery confirms extensive burning throughout their likely range. They were seeking refuge from immediate danger. But how did she know to come here specifically? Asked a newer staff member. After 9 years? That's extraordinary navigation. Elephant memory, Fatima said simply. They never truly forget significant locations, especially those associated with safety or resources. There are documented cases of elephants returning to seasonal water sources they haven't visited in decades. The discussion continued. focusing on scientific implications, documentation requirements, research opportunities. Plans were made for unobtrusive monitoring, for habitat assessment to determine how long the sanctuary lands could support these additional elephants, for coordination with wildlife authorities regarding potential interventions if needed. Through it all, David remained quieter than usual, contributing when necessary, but largely absorbed in his own thoughts. When the meeting finally concluded, Dr. Ndegwa asked him to stay behind. "You broke protocol today," the director said once they were alone, his tone serious but not angry. "Approaching a wild herd, especially one with young calves, violated our safety guidelines." "I know," David acknowledged. "It was unprofessional. I let personal connection override training." Dr. Ndegwa studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Yes, you did, and I understand why. But it can't happen again, regardless of which elephant is involved. We're scientists first, David. The data we collect, the patterns we observe. These have value beyond individual animals." "I understand." That said, the director continued, his expression softening slightly. "What you experienced today is something few humans ever will. A wild elephant, fully integrated into natural society, recognizing a human from her past and acknowledging that connection. It's remarkable. Scientifically significant, yes. But also," he searched for the right word, "also profound." The following days established a new routine at the sanctuary. The wild herd, now referred to in staff reports as Kinna's herd, despite the presence of the actual matriarch, remained on sanctuary land, utilizing the artificial waterhole and grazing in the protected northern quadrant. Observation teams documented their behavior from established blinds, collecting data on social interactions, feeding patterns, and health indicators. The evidence supporting Kinna's identity became increasingly conclusive. Detailed examination of photographs confirmed the specific pattern of her scar and the remnants of the tracking collar. Her estimated age and physical characteristics matched sanctuary records. Most convincingly, her behavior, particularly her apparent familiarity with sanctuary features and her unusual comfort with distant human observation, strongly suggested she was indeed the rehabilitated orphan who had disappeared 9 years earlier. Her calf, estimated to be between 18 to 24 months old, became a subject of particular interest. This was the first documented offspring of a fully rehabilitated and released sanctuary elephant. Living proof that the program's ultimate goal of contributing to wild populations was achievable. "We should name her," suggested one of the younger researchers during a data review session. "We don't name wild elephants," David reminded them automatically. "Only those under our direct care." "But she's Kinna's calf," the researcher persisted. "That makes her part of the sanctuary's extended family, doesn't it?" David found himself smiling despite his professional caution. "Let's compromise. For data purposes, we'll refer to her as K1, first offspring of rehabilitated elephant Kinna, but we'll leave the actual naming to her own kind." As the days passed, the sanctuary adjusted to the presence of the wild herd. Additional water points were established to reduce competition with resident rehabilitating elephants. Grazing areas were monitored for sustainability. Security patrols were increased to ensure the herd remained undisturbed by potential poachers or unauthorized visitors. The fire that had driven them to sanctuary lands gradually burned itself out, extinguished by seasonal rains that finally arrived after months of drought. The landscape beyond the sanctuary boundaries began its remarkable recovery. New green growth emerging from blackened earth with the resilience characteristic of savanna ecosystems. Under normal circumstances, This would signal time for the wild herd to move on, to return to their traditional ranges, now refreshed by rain and new vegetation. The sanctuary staff prepared for their departure, establishing protocols for final documentation and potential future monitoring if the opportunity arose. But Kinna's herd showed no immediate signs of leaving. They established a comfortable routine within sanctuary boundaries, venturing to different areas during the day, but returning regularly to the northern waterhole. The matriarch, apparently satisfied with the safety and resources of this new territory, made no moves to lead them elsewhere. They could stay indefinitely, Dr. Sanderson observed during her latest research visit. The sanctuary lands are extensive enough to support them without significant environmental impact, especially now that the rains have returned, and they're exhibiting none of the stress behaviors we would expect if they felt trapped or confined. But should they stay? David asked, the question that had been troubling him for days finally voiced. They're wild elephants. Their natural patterns, their cultural knowledge, their ecological role, all of these depend on free movement through their traditional ranges. True, Dr. Sanderson acknowledged. But elephant ranges have always been dynamic, shifting in response to environmental conditions, human activity, resource availability. Perhaps what we're witnessing is simply adaptation. Kinna utilizing her unique knowledge of this area to establish a new territory for her herd when their traditional one became temporarily uninhabitable. The question remained unresolved as weeks passed. The herd continued to thrive on sanctuary land, the calves growing visibly stronger as food and water remained plentiful. Kinna herself was observed making regular visits to the perimeter of the rehabilitation enclosures, where younger elephants under human care would gather at the fence, trunks extended in curiosity toward their wild counterpart. She's teaching them, Fatima suggested one evening, as they watched this interaction from a distance. In her own way, she's showing them that there's a life beyond the sanctuary, that rehabilitation leads somewhere real. David considered this possibility. Or maybe she's just curious about them, the way any elephant might be about others of their kind. Perhaps, Fatima conceded. But I've been watching elephants for 40 years, and I know the difference between curiosity and purpose. She comes to that fence at the same time every day, David. She stays for the same duration. She's doing something deliberate, whether we understand it or not. The mystery deepened 2 months after the herd's arrival, when security cameras captured remarkable footage. In the pre-dawn hours, when the sanctuary was quietest, Kinna was recorded approaching the main gate alone, without her calf or other herd members. She stood there for nearly 20 minutes, her trunk exploring the gate mechanism, her body still except for this methodical investigation. Then, as silently as she had arrived, she returned to her herd in the northern quadrant. What was she doing? Dr. Ndegwa asked, reviewing the footage with the senior staff. Testing for weakness? Looking for a way out? The gates aren't barriers to elephants, the security chief reminded them. If she wanted to leave, she could push through the perimeter fence at dozens of points. We maintain it to keep humans out, not elephants in. She was remembering, David said quietly, the realization coming to him with sudden clarity. That gate is where she left the sanctuary 9 years ago, in the transport that took her to the pre-release facility. And it's where she returned the night the security cameras spotted elephants at the gate last year. She's retracing significant locations from her past. This interpretation, while impossible to verify scientifically, resonated with the sanctuary staff's understanding of elephant cognition. Elephants were known to revisit sites of significance, places where herd members had died, where important social events had occurred, where major life transitions had happened. If Kinna retained memories of her rehabilitation, it made sense that she would revisit locations associated with those memories. 3 months after their arrival, the first signs of the herd's eventual departure appeared. They began ranging farther from the central waterhole, exploring the sanctuary's boundaries, spending more time in the southern quadrant nearest to the recovering wilderness beyond. The matriarch was observed leading exploratory excursions that lasted longer each day, though the herd always returned to their established sleeping grounds near the northern water source. "They're preparing to leave," Dr. Negwa confirmed during a research update. "The pattern is consistent with pre-migration behavior we've documented in other wild herds. They're assessing conditions beyond their current territory, establishing potential routes, preparing the younger members for a significant journey." The sanctuary staff maintained their observation protocols, documenting this transition with scientific detachment despite the emotional undercurrent that ran through the team. Many had formed attachments to this herd, particularly to Kinna and her calf, whose daily activities had become a familiar part of sanctuary life. For David, the impending departure stirred complex emotions. He had already said goodbye to Kinna once, had already experienced the mixture of pride and loss that came with successful rehabilitation. This second farewell should have been easier. She was unquestionably thriving, had integrated fully into wild elephant society, had even produced the next generation. Every metric by which the sanctuary measured success had been met and exceeded. Yet as the signs of imminent departure grew clearer, he found himself seeking additional observation shifts, volunteering for the pre-dawn monitoring that offered the quietest time with the herd. Taking his lunch breaks at the northern blind, where Kinna could often be spotted teaching her calf to dust bathe or forage for specific plants. "You're not losing her this time," Fatima told him gently, finding him at the blind one evening as sunset painted the landscape in gold and amber. "She's proven she can find this place if she needs to. And more importantly, she's proven that everything you taught her took root. She's living the life she was meant to have." The departure, when it finally came, occurred at dawn 1 week later. The entire herd had gathered at the southern boundary the previous evening, an unusual concentration that alerted the observation team to the significance of the moment. As the first light broke over the eastern horizon, the matriarch led them in a remarkably direct line toward a section of the perimeter where the landscape beyond showed the lush green of post-fire regeneration. David, who had been notified of the herd's movement, arrived at the nearest observation point just in time to witness their crossing. Through his binoculars, he watched as they moved in their characteristic formation, matriarch leading, younger females with calves protected in the center, more mature females bringing up the rear. Kinna traveled in the middle group, her calf close beside her, her movements confident and purposeful. At the perimeter itself, something unexpected happened. While the matriarch led most of the herd through a gap in the boundary fence, Kinna paused, turning to look back toward the sanctuary. For a moment, she stood separate from the others, her attention focused in the direction of the observation blind where David watched. He would never know if she actually saw him there, if her remarkable senses could detect his presence at that distance. But as he watched, she raised her trunk briefly in what he chose to interpret as acknowledgement, then turned and followed her herd into the wilderness beyond, her calf trotting beside her to keep pace. David remained at the observation point long after the last elephant had disappeared from view, watching the empty landscape where new growth covered the scars of fire, where life continued its ancient cycles of destruction and renewal. The sanctuary would document this departure in its records, would monitor for any return visits, would add Kinna's remarkable story to the growing body of research on elephant rehabilitation and release. But in this moment, between scientist and animal, between human care and wild freedom, there was only the quiet recognition of a journey completed, not ended, but transformed into something new. Somewhere in the vastness of the African bush, Kina would continue her elephant life, would teach her calf the ways of their kind, would perhaps remember sometimes the humans who had once helped her find her way. And here, in the sanctuary that had been her first home, her story would continue too, inspiring those who work to save her kind, reminding them that even in a world of loss and threat, renewal remained possible. That sometimes, against all odds, what was broken could be healed, what was lost could find its way, and what was wild could remain so.